The music spilled across the village square like honey, and Jora Mirren stood at the edge of the lantern light wondering if tonight would be the night someone finally saw her as more than the carter's half-breed daughter who hauled iron to the forge. She had worn her best dress, the blue linen her mother had sewn before the fever took her 3 winters past, and she had braided wildflowers into her dark hair until her reflection in the water trough almost looked like the human girls who laughed together near the musicians. Almost, except for the green cast to her skin that no amount of powder could hide, the small tusks that pressed against her lower lip, the pointed ears that marked her as other. Her frame was willowy and slight, nothing like the brutal orc warriors in the stories men told over ale, but it made no difference. She was still the orc girl, and nobody wanted to dance with the orc girl. The harvest festival swirled around her in a riot of color and sound. Couples paired off as the first reel began, hands clasping, skirts twirling, boots stamping the packed earth in time with the fiddle and drum. Jora watched Thomas Fletcher bow to Mary Ainsworth, watched Peter Cartwright spin young Sarah Hill until she shrieked with laughter. She watched and waited, her own hands folded carefully at her waist, her shoulders straight despite the weight of hope growing heavier with each passing moment. Mistress Mirren. The voice was male, and for one wild heartbeat she thought someone had actually come to ask. But when she turned, she found only Martin Wells, the tanner's apprentice, looking past her toward the cider barrels. "Pardon me, just reaching for a cup." She stepped aside without a word and watched him fill his drink and walk away, back to his friends who stood in a cluster near the blacksmith stall, their heads bent together in conversation that died when one of them noticed her watching. They turned away as one, a wall of shoulders that told her everything she needed to know. This was foolish. She should leave, go back to the small house at the edge of the village where her father would be sitting by the fire, pretending he did not notice how she came home alone from every dance, every festival, every gathering where the young people paired off and laughed together. Robert Mirren had loved an orc woman enough to marry her, damn the consequences, but even his courage had not been enough to shield their daughter from the inheritance of her mother's blood. Jora was turning to go when she saw him. Nathan Cole stood by his forge stall, arms crossed over his broad chest, watching the dancers with an expression she could not quite read. The blacksmith was not a young man, perhaps 30 summers to her 19, and he stood a head taller than most men in the village with shoulders built from years at the anvil. His hair was dark and cropped short, his face square-jawed and serious, marked with a thin scar that ran from his left eyebrow into his hairline. He rarely spoke more than necessary, conducting his business with nods and grunts, and the occasional sentence when words were absolutely required. She had been delivering iron stock to his forge since her father's back injury 2 years ago, hauling the heavy bars from the trader's wagon to Nathan Cole's workshop every month like clockwork. He always paid fairly, always thanked her with a quiet obliged. And sometimes, when she set the iron down with a clang, she caught him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken before he turned back to his work. Now, across the crowded square, his eyes found hers and held. Jora's breath caught in her chest. The music swelled into a new tune, something slower and sweeter, and she told herself not to hope, not to wish, not to imagine that the way Nathan Cole was moving might mean anything at all. But he was moving. He uncrossed his arms and walked away from his stall, his stride long and purposeful, and she realized with a jolt that he was walking toward her. Directly toward her, cutting straight across the square through the dancing couples and chattering groups, and people were starting to notice. She saw Martin Wells elbow his companion, saw Mary Ainsworth's mouth fall open, saw Thomas Fletcher actually stop mid-step to stare. Nathan Cole walked through it all as though none of it mattered, as though the entire village was not suddenly watching, and when he reached her, he did not pause or offer preamble or soften the moment with explanation. He simply held out his hand, palm up, and met her eyes with a steady gaze that asked a question more clearly than words ever could. The square had gone quiet. Even the musicians had faltered, the fiddle trailing off into uncertain silence. "Would you dance?" Nathan said, his voice low and rough as gravel, pitched for her alone despite the audience they had somehow acquired. Jora stared at his hand, broad and calloused and scarred from forge work, and felt something crack open inside her chest. She wanted to take it so badly her fingers trembled. She wanted to say yes, and mean it, and let him lead her into the circle of dancers, and know what it felt like to be chosen, to be wanted, to be worth the risk of public gesture. But she thought of the silence pressing around them, of the stares boring into her back, of the cost this might carry for a man whose livelihood depended on village goodwill. "You do not have to," she whispered, and hated how her voice shook. "I know." Nathan's hand did not waver. "I am asking anyway." Something in his tone told her this was not pity, not charity, not some misguided attempt at chivalry. This was deliberate. This was choice. And when she looked up into his face, she saw no hesitation there, no regret, only a quiet determination that made her believe, just for a moment, that maybe she was worth choosing after all. Jora reached out and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and sure, and he led her into the square as the musicians recovered and struck up the tune again. The other dancers moved aside to give them space, creating a circle that felt like a stage, and Jora's face burned hot as Nathan raised their clasped hands and set his other palm at her waist. She had never danced with anyone before. Her father had taught her the steps years ago, patiently counting time in their kitchen while her mother clapped rhythm, but knowing the steps and actually performing them in front of the entire village were two entirely different things. "I might step on your feet," she warned, barely breathing. "I've had worse in the forge." There was something that might have been humor in Nathan's voice, the barest hint of warmth, and it steadied her more than reassurance would have. They began to move. Nathan was not a graceful dancer, but he was steady, guiding her through the steps with a firm confidence that made it easy to follow. He did not look away from her face, did not acknowledge the whispers that had started up around them, did not seem to care that they were the center of attention in a way that would surely spark gossip for weeks to come. He simply danced with her, step and turn and step again. And for the first time in her life, Jora felt what it was to be held by someone who wanted to hold her. The song seemed to last forever and end too soon. When the final notes faded, Nathan released her waist but kept hold of her hand, and he looked down at her with an expression she could not quite name. "Thank you," he said simply. Jora wanted to laugh at the absurdity of him thanking her when he had just given her something she had been dreaming of since she was old enough to dream. But her throat was too tight for laughter, so she just nodded and let him lead her off the square toward the quieter edge near the water trough. Behind them, the music started up again, and the other dancers gradually returned to their own concerns, though Jora could feel eyes following them even now. She pulled her hand free from Nathan's, suddenly aware of how presumptuous it might look to keep touching him, and folded her arms across her waist instead. "Why?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Why did you do that?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something in the middle distance. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as though he was working out how to shape thoughts that rarely became sentences. "Been watching you," he said. "All season." You haul iron like it weighs nothing, and you never complain, and you are always polite even when men are not polite to you." He paused, then added, "Seemed like someone should dance with you." "You could have asked quietly," Jora pointed out, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You did not have to make it so public." "Yes, I did." Nathan looked at her then, and she saw something fierce in his expression. "If I asked you in a corner, it would look like I was ashamed. I am not ashamed." The simple declaration hit her like a forge hammer to the chest. She had spent her entire life learning to be small, to be unobtrusive, to apologize for the space she took up in a world that had not wanted her mother and did not want her. And here was Nathan Cole, the respected blacksmith, saying without hesitation that he was not ashamed to be seen with her. "You barely know me," she whispered. "I know enough." He shifted his weight, glanced back at his forge stall where the fire still glowed red in its hearth. "I should return to work, but I am glad you let me dance with you." He walked away before she could find words to respond, leaving her standing alone by the water trough with her pulse racing and her mind spinning and the ghost of his touch still warm on her hand. The festival continued around her, but Jora barely noticed. She stayed another hour, mostly because leaving immediately would look too much like fleeing, and eventually her father found her, and they walked home together through the autumn darkness. Robert Mirren did not ask what had happened, but he squeezed her shoulder when they reached their door, and that was enough. That night, Jora lay in her narrow bed and replayed the dance over and over in her mind, trying to memorize every detail before time wore it smooth. The way Nathan had crossed the square without hesitation, the steadiness of his hand at her waist, the fierce quiet of his voice when he said he was not ashamed. She told herself not to hope for more. One dance did not make a courtship, and she knew better than to build dreams on a single kind gesture. But when she finally slept, she dreamed of calloused hands and forge fire warmth, and woke with something like hope still burning in her chest. The next morning, Jora loaded her father's cart with the week's deliveries and set out on her rounds. It was not a large operation, just enough hauling work to keep food on the table and coin in the strongbox, but she liked the independence of it, the way physical labor silenced the thoughts that sometimes grew too loud. Today she had flour for the mill, wool for the weaver, and tools to return to Nathan Cole's forge. She saved the forge for last. The workshop sat at the south end of the village, a sturdy stone building with a slate roof and wide doors that stood open to the autumn morning. Inside, the fire roared and metal sang as Nathan brought his hammer down in steady rhythm, shaping a horseshoe on the anvil. He wore a leather apron over his work clothes, and sweat gleamed on his forearms where he had rolled up his sleeves. Jora stopped the cart outside and began unloading the tools, mended hoes and sharpened scythes that farmers had left for repair. She was stacking them just inside the door when Nathan set down his hammer and turned to face her. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." Jora kept her voice carefully neutral, unsure what tone to take after last night. "Friend, acquaintance, something more. Here are the tools you finished. Farmer Harris sent payment, said to tell you he is well pleased with the plow blade." Nathan nodded and wiped his hands on his apron, then crossed to the workbench where a small leather purse waited. He brought it back and placed it in her palm, coins for her delivery fee, and his fingers brushed hers in the exchange. The touch lasted half a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Obliged," he said, meeting her eyes. Then, as though the words required physical effort, "Dance last night. I meant what I said, not ashamed." Jora's throat went tight. In the clear light of morning, with the festival over and real life reasserting itself, she had half expected him to regret the gesture. But here he stood, steady as stone, repeating his intention as though he needed her to understand it completely. "I know," she managed. "Thank you. It meant a great deal to me." "Good." Nathan glanced at the cart, then back at her. "You hauling today? Just the usual rounds? Why, thought you might like to learn some smithing, if you have time." He said it casually, but she caught the slight tension in his shoulders, the way he was already bracing for rejection. "You are strong and you have good hands. Could teach you the basics if you wanted." Jora stared at him. "You want to teach me to smith, if you want to learn." She thought of the long, empty afternoons when deliveries were finished, and there was nothing to do but return home and help her father with mending. She thought of the way Nathan's face changed when he worked metal, the focus and satisfaction that came from shaping something useful with his own hands. She thought of the way he had danced with her last night, steady and sure, and how she had not wanted the song to end. "Yes," she said before caution could intervene. "I would like that," something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of Nathan's mouth. "Come back tomorrow afternoon, then. Bring your own gloves if you have them. Leather is best. I will start you on the fundamentals." "Tomorrow," Jora agreed, and felt that dangerous hope flare brighter in her chest. She finished her deliveries in a daze and drove home with her mind already halfway back at the forge, imagining what it would be like to stand at the anvil, to feel the hammer in her hand, to create instead of merely carrying what others had made. Her father noticed her distraction at supper and asked gentle questions until the story spilled out. Everything about the dance and the offer, and the way Nathan Cole looked at her like she was worth seeing. Jora Mirren listened without interrupting, his weathered face thoughtful. When she finished, he set down his spoon and folded his hands on the table. "Nathan Cole is a good man," he said carefully. "But you should know what you are risking, Jora. People talk. If you spend time at his forge, they will assume things, they may say things, and it might cost him business. He seems willing to take that risk. Maybe, but you should be willing to walk away if it goes badly." Her father's voice was gentle but firm. "I do not want you hurt, and I do not want you trapped by hope that has nowhere to go." Jora met his eyes across the table. "Did you walk away from Mother when people talked? That was different. Your mother and I were both adults with nothing to lose. Nathan has a business to protect, and you have your whole life ahead of you. Then, maybe my whole life should include choosing what I want instead of what is safe." Jora Mirren sighed, but she saw approval in his expression even as he shook his head. "You have more of your mother in you than I realized. Be careful, daughter, but be happy if you can." That night, Jora dug out her father's old leather gloves and tried them on, flexing her fingers and imagining the weight of a hammer. They fit well enough. She set them by the door so she would not forget them in the morning, and went to bed early so the night would pass faster. The next afternoon she presented herself at Nathan Cole's forge, gloves in hand and heart in her throat. He looked up from the sword blade he was grinding and nodded her toward the back of the workshop. "First thing you need to understand is safety," he said, setting down the blade. "Forge can kill you in a dozen ways. Fire, hot metal sparks bad footing. You pay attention, you follow instructions, you do not take risks until you know what you are doing. Understood? Understood." Nathan spent the next hour walking her through the forge, pointing out tools and explaining their uses, showing her how to read the heat of metal by its color, how to hold a hammer for control rather than power, how to work the bellows to keep the fire at proper temperature. He was patient and thorough, repeating himself when she asked questions, correcting her grip without making her feel foolish. When he finally set her in front of the anvil with a piece of scrap iron and told her to flatten it, Jora felt her pulse quicken with nervous excitement. "Do not swing hard," Nathan warned, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him or maybe from the forge. "Let the hammer do the work. It is about control and repetition, not brute force." She brought the hammer down, and the metal rang. The strike was off-center and weak, barely leaving a mark, and frustration flared hot in her chest. "Again," Nathan said calmly. She struck again and again and again, until her arm ached and sweat ran down her back and the iron finally began to flatten under her blows. It was exhausting and exhilarating, and nothing like she had imagined. This was not the elegant artistry she had pictured, but a kind of meditation in repetition, muscle and metal and the slowly changing shape beneath the hammer. When Nathan finally called a halt, Jora set down the hammer with a gasp and stared at what she had made. It was barely anything, just a chunk of iron that was now flatter than before, but it was also proof that she could do this. "Good start," Nathan said, and she heard genuine approval in his voice. "You did not quit, and you corrected your angle without prompting. That is more than most manage on the first day." Jora looked up at him, saw him watching her with that same intense focus he turned on his metalwork, and felt heat that had nothing to do with the forge rise in her face. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes." She would have agreed to come every day if he asked, but she tried to sound casual about it. "Thank you for teaching me. Obliged for the company." It became a pattern. Jora finished her deliveries and came to the forge most afternoons, and Nathan taught her with the same patient intensity he brought to his own work. She learned to read metal and fire, to shape horseshoes and nails and simple tools, to move around the forge with confidence. Her hands grew more calloused and her arms grew stronger, and Nathan praised her progress with quiet words that felt more valuable than gold. And as the days passed, she began to notice other things. The way he always positioned himself between her and the hottest part of the fire. The way his instructions often came with his hand covering hers on the hammer, guiding her strikes. The way he smiled, really smiled, when she successfully completed a difficult piece. She was not imagining the way he looked at her. She was almost certain she was not imagining it. But Nathan never said anything beyond the work, never crossed the line from teacher to something more, and Jora did not know how to ask without risking the fragile thing growing between them. 3 weeks after she started learning smithwork, she arrived at the forge to find it empty. The fire was banked low and the tools were hung neatly in their places, but Nathan was nowhere to be seen. Jora hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether to wait or leave, when she heard raised voices from behind the building. She should not eavesdrop. She knew she should not. But something in the angry tone made her ease around the side of the forge, until she could see into the small yard behind it. Nathan stood with his arms crossed, facing 3 men Jora recognized from the village. Martin Wells, the tanner's apprentice, Thomas Fletcher, and Gregory Barnes, who farmed the land north of town. They had him half surrounded, and their body language was aggressive in a way that made her stomach clench. "We are just saying, you should think about your business," Thomas was saying, his voice wheedling but with an edge beneath. "People are starting to talk. People are starting to wonder if they want to bring their custom to a man who is teaching smithwork to an orc." "They can wonder what they like," Nathan said flatly. "It is not right," Martin insisted. "She does not belong at a forge. She does not belong in the village. Her kind are monsters, Cole. Everyone knows it. And you making a show of her, dancing with her, teaching her, it makes people uncomfortable." "Then people can be uncomfortable." Nathan's voice was hard as iron. "Jora Mirren does good work, pays her bills and treats folks with more respect than they give her. I will teach whoever I please." "You are making a mistake," Gregory said, and there was something almost threatening in his tone. "You keep this up, you will find people taking their trade elsewhere. Might even find you have trouble getting iron stock if the traders think you are too friendly with orcs." Nathan stepped forward, and all 3 men stepped back. He was not a violent man, but he was broad and strong, and there was something dangerous in the set of his shoulders now. "Are you threatening me?" he asked quietly. "No threats," Thomas said quickly. "Just friendly advice. You are a good smith, Nathan, best in 3 villages. But that will not matter if people do not come to you. Think about that." They left, brushing past Jora without seeming to notice her pressed against the wall. She waited until they were out of sight, then stepped into the yard on shaking legs. Nathan turned and saw her, and his expression shifted from anger to something that might have been regret. "You heard," he said. "It was not a question." "Enough." Jora wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm autumn afternoon. "They are right, Nathan. People are talking. You are going to lose business because of me. I do not care. You should." She forced the words out past the knot in her throat. "You worked hard to build this forge. You have a reputation. You should not throw it away because you felt sorry for me at a dance." Nathan crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and caught her shoulders in his big hands, gentle but firm enough to keep her from retreating. His face was intense, almost angry, and she realized with a start that the anger was not for her but on her behalf. "Listen to me," he said, low and fierce. "I did not dance with you because I felt sorry for you. I danced with you because I wanted to. I am teaching you because you have talent and because I like having you here. And if the price of that is a few small-minded fools taking their business elsewhere, then that is a price I am willing to pay. But no." His grip tightened fractionally. "You do not get to decide what I risk, Jora. You do not get to protect me from consequences I am choosing freely. I am not a child and I am not a fool. I know what I am doing." Jora stared up at him, into those serious dark eyes, and saw nothing but certainty there. He meant it, every word, and something that had been clenched tight in her chest for weeks suddenly loosened. "I do not want you to regret this," she whispered. "I will not. You do not know that, you cannot know that." Nathan was quiet for a moment, his hands still warm on her shoulders, and when he spoke again his voice was softer but no less certain. "I have been alone a long time," he said. "Built this forge from nothing, made a name for myself, made a life that was good enough. But it was never more than enough, if you understand. And then you came along, and I started to think maybe good enough was not all I wanted anymore." Jora's breath caught. "Nathan, I am not good with words," he interrupted. "Never have been. But I can tell you this. These past weeks, teaching you, watching you learn, having you in my forge, those have been the best weeks I have had in years. So whatever those men think, whatever business I might lose, it is worth it. You are worth it." Tears pricked hot behind Jora's eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. "I do not know what to say. Do not say anything. Just keep coming to the forge, keep learning, keep letting me see you." His mouth quirked in what was almost a smile. "And maybe let me take you to supper sometime, if you want." "Is that allowed?" she asked, and was surprised to find she could still joke. "I thought we were just teacher and student." "I think we stopped being just teacher and student about 2 weeks ago," Nathan said dryly. "I was just waiting for the right time to mention it." Jora laughed, slightly breathless, and Nathan released her shoulders and stepped back, giving her space to breathe. "So," he prompted, "supper?" "Yes," Jora said, and felt that dangerous hope burst into full flame inside her. "Yes, I would like that." They had supper that night at the small tavern on the edge of the village, tucked into a corner table where the lamplight was warm, and the noise of other patrons formed a buffer against curious stares. Nathan ordered stew and bread, and they talked about metalwork and weather and safe, inconsequential things until the conversation found its own rhythm. Jora told him about her childhood, about growing up caught between 2 worlds, neither fully human nor fully orc. She told him about her mother, the orc woman who had come to the village as part of a peace delegation, and stayed because she fell in love with a human carter. She told him about the loneliness that had shaped her life, the way she had learned to be quiet and unobtrusive and grateful for whatever scraps of kindness came her way. Nathan listened without interrupting, his attention complete and unwavering, and when she finally trailed off, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You should not have to be grateful for basic decency," he said quietly. "People should be better, but they are not. No. But that does not mean you deserved it." Jora turned her hand under his, threading their fingers together, and felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was what she had been missing all her life, this simple certainty of being wanted, being chosen, being enough. They talked until the tavern began to empty, and when Nathan walked her home through the autumn darkness, he took her hand again and did not let go until they reached her door. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow," she agreed, and watched him walk away with her heart so full it ached. The boycott began 3 days later. Jora noticed it first when she arrived at the forge to find it unusually empty. Nathan was working alone as always, but the usual pile of projects waiting for completion was smaller than normal, and there were no farmers standing in the doorway waiting to discuss repairs. "Slow day?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Nathan glanced up from the plow blade he was mending, and she saw the tightness around his eyes. Something like that. Over the next week, it became impossible to ignore. The steady stream of customers that usually kept Nathan busy from dawn until dark slowed to a trickle. Old commissions were completed and collected, but new work failed to arrive. Farmers who normally brought their tools to Nathan began making the trek to the smith 2 villages over. Even the routine maintenance work, the sharpening and mending that formed the backbone of forge income, seemed to have dried up. Jora knew it was her fault. She stopped coming to the forge, told Nathan she was busy with deliveries, made excuses that they both knew were hollow. But Nathan showed up at her door on the 3rd day and told her in a voice that brooked no argument that if she did not come back to the forge, he would consider it a personal insult. "You are not driving me away," he said flatly. "The boycott is their choice, not yours. You do not get to make decisions for me." So she came back, but every empty afternoon felt like an accusation. Every tool Nathan had time to organize, every slow day when he worked on his own projects instead of customer commissions, felt like proof that she was destroying the life he had built. She said as much one afternoon when the silence in the forge grew too heavy to bear. Nathan set down the knife he was sharpening and turned to face her fully. "You want to know what I think about this boycott? I can guess. I think it is exposing who in this village has integrity and who does not. I think it is showing me exactly which men will turn on someone the moment it is convenient." He paused, then added with quiet intensity, "And I think it will not last, because at the end of the day I am the best smith these people have access to, and quality wins over prejudice when their tools break and their horses need shoeing. You do not know that. I know that Samuel Pritchard brought me a broken wheel fitting yesterday, because the smith he went to could not balance it properly. I know that Mary Ainsworth commissioned a new fire poker, because mine lasts 3 times longer than cheap work. People are angry now, but they will come back when they remember why they used my forge in the first place." Jora wanted to believe him, but as the weeks passed and the boycott held, she began to wonder if maybe Nathan's faith was misplaced. Maybe prejudice was stronger than quality. Maybe she had ruined everything by being foolish enough to hope. Then, 6 weeks after the boycott began, the miller's daughter came to the forge. Claire Davison was a practical woman in her middle 30s, respected in the village for her steady temperament, and the sharp business sense she brought to her father's mill. She carried a broken gear mechanism, set it on Nathan's workbench, and looked him straight in the eye. "I need this mended," she said. "Can you do it by tomorrow?" Nathan examined the gear, nodded. "I can, standard rate." "Good." Claire pulled out her purse and counted coins onto the bench, then glanced at Jora standing by the anvil. "You the one he is teaching?" Jora lifted her chin. "Yes." "My mother was from the eastern settlements, had red hair and freckles, and people called her a witch because she knew herb lore." Claire's voice was matter-of-fact but not unkind. "Took 10 years before the village stopped treating my father like he had committed treason by marrying her." "You have courage, girl. So does Nathan Cole. That matters more than gossip." She left before Jora could respond, and the forge suddenly felt lighter than it had in weeks. After that, the dam began to crack. Samuel Pritchard returned with a wagon full of tools that needed sharpening. Mary Ainsworth brought her sister, who wanted a custom fire screen. Other customers trickled back one by one, some shamefaced, some defiant, all of them needing work that only Nathan could properly provide. The boycott did not disappear overnight, but it broke apart slowly over the following weeks, eroded by the simple reality that Nathan Cole was an excellent smith, and excellent smiths were not easy to replace. By the time the first frost arrived, the forge was busy again, and while some villagers still muttered about the orc girl, most had returned to treating Nathan with the respect his skill commanded. Jora kept coming to the forge, and Nathan kept teaching her, and slowly the lessons evolved into something more like partnership. She learned to work iron and steel, to create tools that were balanced and strong, to read metal as though it was a language she had always known. Nathan praised her work with increasing frequency, and sometimes, when they worked side by side at neighboring anvils, their eyes would meet across the forge, and she would see something in his expression that made her pulse race. He courted her carefully, with all the patience he brought to his metalwork. Suppers at the tavern became a regular occurrence. Long walks through the autumn countryside, talking about everything and nothing. Small gifts, a knife he had forged with her name etched into the blade, a pair of leather gloves cut to fit her hands exactly. She fell in love with him gradually, and then all at once, the way snow builds on a branch until the weight becomes impossible to ignore. She fell in love with his steadiness, his quiet integrity, the way he made her feel seen and valued and beautiful despite everything the world had taught her about her own worth. She fell in love with the man who had crossed a village square and taken her hand in front of everyone, and who had meant every word when he said he was not ashamed. Winter arrived in earnest, bringing snow and cold and the slow season when farmers stayed close to home, and smithwork focused on maintenance and preparation for spring. Nathan used the time to teach Jora more advanced techniques, and she discovered she had a gift for decorative ironwork, the delicate scrolls and patterns that turned functional pieces into art. She was working on a set of gate hinges, concentrating on the curve of a vine detail, when Nathan appeared at her elbow with something wrapped in cloth. "I made you something," he said, gruff with nerves. "Was going to wait until spring, but I am not good at waiting." Jora set down her hammer and took the package, aware of her heart hammering against her ribs. The cloth fell away to reveal a circlet of forged iron, delicate as lace despite the strength of the metal, worked into a pattern of leaves and flowers that must have taken hours to complete. She stared at it, unable to breathe. "It is a betrothal band," Nathan said quietly, "meant to be worn at festivals and formal occasions to show you are spoken for." He paused, then continued in a rush that was unlike his usual careful speech. "I am asking if you will marry me, Jora. I know it is soon, and I know people will talk, and I know I am not young or charming or any of the things women are supposed to want. But I love you, and I think maybe you love me, and I want you in my life as more than my apprentice or my friend. I want you as my wife, if you will have me." Jora looked up from the circlet into Nathan's face, saw the vulnerability there beneath the gruff exterior, and felt tears spill hot down her cheeks. "Yes," she said, voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Nathan, I will marry you." The relief that washed over his expression was so profound, it made her heart ache. He took the circlet from her hands and settled it carefully on her head, his fingers gentle. And then he cupped her face and kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this," he promised. "I know," Jora whispered, and knew it was true. They told her father that evening, and Robert Mirren clapped Nathan on the shoulder and told him he had been hoping for this since the night of the harvest dance. They made plans for a spring wedding, something small and simple, just family and close friends in the village square. But first there was winter to survive, and work to complete, and a life to build together in the space between forge and home. Jora moved into Nathan's house the week after the betrothal, because it seemed foolish to maintain two households when they would be married come spring. The house was sturdy and well built, attached to the back of the forge, so Nathan had never far to travel for work. It had a main room with a good fireplace, a bedroom, and a small loft that could be converted into additional space if needed. They learned each other in the intimate ways of shared domestic life. Nathan rose early and made breakfast, strong tea and porridge with honey. Jora kept the house clean and managed the accounts, her neat handwriting filling the ledger Nathan had always neglected. They worked together in the forge during the day and ate supper together in the evening. And sometimes Nathan played a battered fiddle he kept in the corner while Jora mended or sketched designs for new ironwork. It was comfortable and right and better than anything she had imagined. And when Nathan reached for her in the darkness of their shared bed, she went to him with joy and without reservation. Winter deepened, and with it came the long nights and short days when the forge fire provided as much light as warmth. Jora continued to improve her smithing, graduating from simple tools to complex mechanisms. Nathan began introducing her to customers as his partner, and most accepted it with varying degrees of grace. There were still those who muttered, still those who refused to deal with an orc, but their numbers dwindled as Jora proved her skill. When Farmer Harris came to collect a plowshare, Jora had forged and found it was the best balanced tool he had ever used. Word spread. When the tavern keeper commissioned a decorative sign bracket, and Jora created something so beautiful it became a village landmark, more people began to take notice. She was not just the orc girl anymore. She was Jora, the blacksmith's apprentice and betrothed. She was Jora, who could forge a perfect horseshoe and create ironwork delicate enough to rival silver. She was Jora who belonged. Spring arrived with mud and melt, and the first green shoots pushing through the snow. Nathan and Jora set the wedding date for the first day of the spring planting festival, and the village made preparations. There were still those who disapproved, but most people seemed willing to accept the marriage with the same resignation they accepted any done deal. The ceremony was held in the village square on a clear, bright morning when the world smelled of earth and growing things. Jora wore a new dress, green as spring leaves, and the betrothal circlet Nathan had forged. Nathan wore his best clothes, dark wool and a clean shirt, and he held her hand with the same steady certainty he had shown the night of the harvest dance. The village elder performed the ceremony, binding their hands with braided cord and speaking the traditional words that made them husband and wife in the eyes of the community. When it was done, Nathan kissed her in front of everyone, and Jora heard a scatter of applause that sounded genuine. They celebrated with a feast in the square, tables laden with food and drink, musicians playing the same tunes that had accompanied the harvest dance months ago. Jora found herself surrounded by well-wishers, some sincere, some awkward, all of them representing a kind of acceptance she had never expected to receive. Claire Davison hugged her and told her to be happy. Mary Ainsworth brought a wedding gift, a set of embroidered linens for their home. Even Martin Wells offered stiff congratulations, though he could not quite meet her eyes when he did it. But the moment that mattered most came when the dancing began. Nathan led her into the square, just as he had done at the Harvest Festival, and this time there was no shocked silence, no stares of disbelief. There were just other couples joining them, filling the square with movement and music, and when Nathan spun her around she saw her father dancing with Claire Davison, saw Samuel Pritchard bow to his wife, saw the whole village moving together in a pattern that included her for the first time in her life. "You made this happen," she said to Nathan as they turned through the steps. "We made it happen," he corrected. "Together." Jora rested her head against his chest and let the music carry them, and thought about the girl she had been, standing alone at the edge of the lantern light, hoping someone would see her as worth choosing. That girl felt like a distant memory now, replaced by a woman who knew her own value and had found a man who recognized it. The song ended, and another began, and they kept dancing until the stars came out and the lanterns were lit, and the celebration slowly wound down into quiet conversations, and the contented exhaustion of a day well spent. Nathan and Jora walked home through the spring darkness, hand in hand, and when they reached the house, Nathan swept her up and carried her across the threshold in the traditional gesture of new marriage. He set her down gently in the main room, kissed her forehead, and went to build up the fire while she lit the lamps. "Happy?" he asked, glancing back at her. "More than I thought possible," Jora admitted. "You?" "Yes." Nathan straightened from the hearth and crossed to where she stood, pulling her into his arms. "I love you, Jora Cole. I will tell you that every day for the rest of our lives, and it still will not be enough to express what you mean to me." Jora tilted her face up for his kiss, tasting the promise on his lips, and let herself believe in the future they were building together. The years that followed were good ones. The forge prospered as word of their combined skill spread beyond the village. Jora became known in her own right as a master of decorative ironwork, and commissions came from neighboring settlements for gates and signs and architectural details. Nathan continued to handle the practical work, tools and horseshoes and wagon fittings, and together they built a reputation that attracted customers from across the region. They expanded the forge, adding a second anvil and more workspace, hiring an apprentice to help with the basic tasks. They added rooms to the house, preparing for a future that might include children. They became part of the fabric of village life, respected for their work and accepted for who they were. It was not always easy. There were still moments of prejudice, still whispered comments and cold shoulders from those who could not see past Jora's green skin. But those moments grew rarer as time passed, and they learned to face them together with the same steady partnership that defined their marriage. 3 years after the wedding, Jora discovered she was pregnant. She told Nathan one evening in the forge, after the apprentice had gone home and they were alone in the firelight. He went very still, the hammer frozen mid-swing, and then he set down his tools and crossed to where she stood. "You are certain?" he asked, voice rough with emotion. "As certain as I can be. Claire Davison says all the signs are there." Nathan pulled her into his arms, so gently it made her throat ache, and she felt him trembling against her. "I am going to be a father," he said, as though testing the words. "A good one," Jora promised. He held her for a long moment, then pulled back and framed her face with his hands, looking at her with an expression of such profound love it took her breath away. "You have given me everything," he said quietly. "A purpose, a partner, a family. I never thought I would have this, Jora. I never thought I deserved it." "You deserve it," she said fiercely. "You deserve every good thing, Nathan Cole, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." The pregnancy progressed without complication, and in early spring, Jora delivered a healthy son with his father's dark hair and his mother's pointed ears. They named him Peter, and Nathan held the baby with the same careful reverence he brought to his most delicate ironwork. Peter was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Deanna, who had her mother's green-tinted skin and her father's serious eyes. Jora returned to forge work between pregnancies, bringing the children with her, teaching them from infancy that metal and fire were tools to be respected but not feared. The village children played with Peter and Deanna without comment, growing up in a world where a half-orc child was simply another playmate. It was not the world Jora had known as a girl, but it was the world she and Nathan were helping to build, one small gesture of acceptance at a time. The years accumulated like iron shavings on the forge floor, small and unremarkable individually, but building into something substantial over time. Nathan's hair went gray at the temples, and Jora found laugh lines forming around her eyes. Their children grew strong and healthy, learning smith work as naturally as walking. The forge continued to prosper, and their reputation spread far enough that they began to receive commissions from towns they had never visited. And every year, on the first day of the planting festival, Nathan took Jora's hand and led her into the village square to dance. It became a tradition, something the village anticipated and celebrated. The blacksmith and his wife, dancing together as they had done on the night that changed both their lives. A reminder that courage and choice could reshape a world that seemed immutable. 10 years after that first harvest dance, Jora stood in the square with Nathan's hand warm in hers and looked around at the celebrating villagers. Peter was dancing with the cooper's daughter, a gangly boy of 7 trying to mimic his father's steady grace. Deanna sat on her grandfather's lap, too young yet to join the dancers, watching everything with wide, curious eyes. The music swelled, and Nathan pulled Jora close, and they moved through the familiar steps with the ease of long practice. "You remember the first time we danced?" Jora asked, smiling up at her husband. "I remember everything about that night." Nathan's expression was soft with memory. "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever seen, standing there alone, still hoping someone would ask. I remember deciding that if I did not ask, I would be a coward. I remember the way you looked at me when you took my hand, like I had just given you something precious." "You did," Jora said simply. "You gave me yourself. You gave me a future. You gave me a place to belong." "No." Nathan shook his head, his grip tightening on her waist. "I just recognized what was already there. You always belonged, Jora. The world just needed to catch up." She laughed, delighted by the sentiment, and let him spin her around as the music picked up tempo. The square was full of dancers now, couples and families and friends all moving together in the patterns of tradition and celebration. No one stared at the blacksmith and his orc wife anymore. They were simply Nathan and Jora, respected craftspeople and valued members of the community. The song ended, and another began, and they danced on into the spring night, surrounded by the life they had built together through choice and courage, and the steady work of loving each other, despite all the reasons the world had told them not to. When the festival finally wound down, and they walked home through the familiar darkness, Peter between them holding both their hands and Deanna drowsing on Nathan's shoulder. Jora looked up at the stars and felt profound gratitude for the path that had led her here. She had been the girl nobody would dance with, standing alone at the edge of hope. And then Nathan Cole had taken her hand in front of everyone, and everything had changed. Not because the world had suddenly become kind, but because two people had decided that love was worth the cost of courage. Because a man had looked past green skin and tusks and seen a woman worth knowing. Because she had been brave enough to take the hand that was offered and build a life from that single gesture. The forge came into view, dark now but still radiating the memory of days' heat, and Jora felt Nathan's arm come around her shoulders. "Home," he said simply, and she heard the contentment in his voice. "Home," she agreed, and knew it was true in every sense that mattered. They had made a home together, not just a building but a refuge, a partnership, a family. They had made a life that honored both their courage and their love, and they had done it by refusing to let fear or prejudice or doubt prevent them from choosing each other. Peter tugged on her hand, chattering about the festival and the dancing and the honey cakes they had eaten. Deanna stirred on Nathan's shoulder and murmured something about horses. Nathan caught Jora's eye over their children's heads and smiled, and in that moment she saw their entire history reflected back at her. The harvest dance, the forge lessons, the boycott and the betrothal and the wedding, the births and the hard work and the 1,000 small victories that had brought them here. "I love you," she said, simple and sure. "I love you too," Nathan replied and pushed open the door to their home. They carried the children inside and put them to bed, Peter in his narrow cot and Deanna in her cradle. And then they sat together by the hearth and let the fire burn low while the night settled around them. Nathan pulled Jora close against his side, and she rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence until sleep began to claim them both. Tomorrow, there would be forge work and customers, and all the ordinary tasks that filled their days. Tomorrow Peter would practice his letters, and Diana would take her first uncertain steps. Tomorrow the world would continue to turn, bringing new challenges and new joys in equal measure. But tonight they were simply together, a family built on love and courage and the decision one man had made to cross a village square and take an orc girl's hand. It had been enough then. It was enough now. And Jora knew, with the certainty of lived experience, that it would always be enough. Years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of seasons, each one adding depth to the life they had built. The forge remained the heart of their existence, a place where metal was transformed through fire and will into objects of beauty and function. Peter grew into a skilled smith in his own right, with his father's patience and his mother's eye for decorative detail. Deanna surprised them by showing more interest in the business side of the forge, and by the time she was 12, she was managing the accounts with efficiency that made Nathan shake his head in wonder. The village changed around them too, slowly becoming a place where mixed families were uncommon but not unheard of, where children grew up understanding that difference was not the same as danger. Jora knew she and Nathan were not solely responsible for that change, but she also knew they had played their part. Every time they walked through the square hand in hand, every time they conducted business with dignity and skill, every time their children laughed with human friends, they were writing a new story over the old prejudices. More orc families came to the region, drawn by word that this village was less hostile than most. Some stayed, some moved on, but each one made it easier for the next. Nathan welcomed them to the forge if they needed work, and Jora made sure they knew where to find acceptance when they needed it. 20 years after that first harvest dance, the village held a celebration to mark Nathan Cole's quarter century, as the village blacksmith. The entire community turned out to honor him, and Jora stood beside her husband while speaker after speaker rose to praise his craftsmanship and integrity. But the moment she treasured most came at the end of the evening when old Robert Mirren, gray and stooped now but still clear-eyed, stood and raised his cup. "My daughter was alone for a long time," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "And I did not know how to help her, because the loneliness was not something I could fix with work or money or even love. It was the loneliness of being seen as other, of being judged before she ever opened her mouth. And then Nathan Cole did something very simple. He asked her to dance. He treated her like she mattered, and from that small act of decency came everything good that followed." Robert paused, looking directly at Nathan and Jora where they stood together. "So I raise my cup to Nathan Cole, who makes excellent tools and beautiful ironwork. But more importantly, I raise my cup to the man who saw my daughter's worth when others would not, and who has spent 20 years proving that love and courage can change the world, one small gesture at a time." The crowd erupted in applause, and Jora felt tears streaming down her face. Nathan's arm came around her waist, steady and sure, and she leaned into his strength and let herself feel the full weight of gratitude for the path their lives had taken. When the celebration finally ended and they walked home through the familiar streets, Peter and Deanna having long since taken the grandchildren home to bed, Nathan stopped in the middle of the square. "Dance with me," he said, holding out his hand just as he had done 20 years ago. Jora laughed, breathless with joy, and took his hand. There was no music this time, just the two of them moving through remembered steps under the stars, dancing to a rhythm only they could hear. "Thank you," she said as they turned slowly in the empty square. "For what? For seeing me. For choosing me. For building this life with me." Nathan pulled her close, close enough that she could feel his heartbeat against her own. "You were always worth seeing, Jora. I just had the privilege of being the one brave enough to look." She kissed him then, long and deep, and full of all the love that had only grown stronger with time. And when they finally broke apart, the moon had risen high above the village. They walked home hand in hand, two people who had built something beautiful from a single moment of courage, and Jora knew that whatever years remained to them would be good ones. Not because life would be easy or because prejudice had been completely conquered, but because they had each other, and that had always been enough. The forge waited for them in the darkness, banked coals still glowing with residual heat, tools hung in their proper places, ready for tomorrow's work. Their home stood attached to it, warm and welcoming, filled with the accumulated memories of decades together. Nathan opened the door and Jora stepped inside, and they closed out the night together in the place they had made their own. Years later, when their hair had gone fully gray, and their hands had grown gnarled with age and arthritis, when Peter ran the forge with his own children as apprentices, and Diana managed a business that now stretched across 3 counties, when the village had grown into a small town, and the world had changed in ways both profound and subtle, Nathan and Jora still danced. Every spring festival, without fail, the old blacksmith would take his wife's hand and lead her into the square. Their steps were slower now, their movements careful, but the gesture remained the same. The town watched with affection, seeing in the elderly couple a reminder of where they had come from and how far they had traveled together. And on the last spring festival Nathan attended, 3 months before a fever took him gently in his sleep, he held Jora close in the middle of the square and whispered in her ear. "No regrets," he said simply. "Not one. You were the best choice I ever made." "We were the best choice," Jora corrected, as she had done countless times over the years. "Together." Nathan smiled and kissed her forehead, and they finished the dance surrounded by family and friends and the community they had helped to shape. When he died, the town mourned him as they would mourn any great man, and Jora laid him to rest with the iron circlet he had forged for their betrothal placed on his chest. She stood at the grave with her children and grandchildren around her, and she spoke the words that mattered most. "You taught me that I was worth choosing," she said to the fresh earth, "and I will carry that lesson until I join you. Thank you, Nathan Cole. Thank you for dancing with me when nobody else would. Thank you for loving me when the world said you should not. Thank you for everything." She lived another 5 years after Nathan passed. Years spent teaching her grandchildren smithwork and telling stories about the man who had changed her life with a single gesture. She lived long enough to see her great-grandchildren born, long enough to see the town embrace its mixed families without question, long enough to know that the world she left behind was better than the one she had been born into. And when her own time came, she went peacefully in her sleep with a smile on her face, dreaming of a harvest dance long ago and a man who had crossed a village square to take her hand in front of everyone. They buried her next to Nathan, and the town turned out to honor her memory just as they had honored his. Peter spoke at the service, his voice breaking as he talked about his mother's courage and grace. Deanna read a letter her mother had written years earlier, instructions for how to live a life of integrity and love. The grandchildren planted an oak tree at the head of the graves, something that would grow strong and provide shelter for generations to come. But the tribute that would have meant the most to Jora came from an unexpected source. Martin Wells, ancient now and walking with a cane, approached Peter after the service and pressed something into his hand. "Your mother was a better person than I was," he said gruffly. "Took me years to see it, but she never held my foolishness against me, and your father was the best man I ever knew. They taught me that courage is not about grand gestures. It is about showing up and doing the right thing even when it costs you something. Tell your children that. Make sure they remember." Peter looked down at what Martin had given him and felt his throat go tight. It was a small iron flower, simple but beautifully crafted, the kind of decorative work his mother had been known for. "She made this for my wife's birthday, years ago," Martin said quietly. "When Alice died, I could not bear to part with it, but I think it should go back to your family. A reminder of the beauty your mother brought into the world." Peter closed his fingers around the iron flower and nodded, unable to speak. The years continued to turn, and the story of Nathan Cole and Jora Mirren became the kind of legend that towns tell to their children. The story of how love and courage had transformed a community, one dance at a time. The story of an orc girl nobody would dance with, and the blacksmith who took her hand in front of everyone and built a life from that single moment of bravery. Their great-grandchildren worked the forge that still bore the Cole name, and sometimes, on spring festival nights when the dancing filled the square, the oldest residents would point to the oak tree on the hill and tell the young people about the couple buried there. "She stood alone at the edge of the dance," they would say, "and everyone ignored her because she was different. But then Nathan Cole walked across that square like he was going to war, and he took her hand and everything changed. Not all at once, maybe, not perfectly, but it changed. And we are all better for it." The story became part of the town's identity, a reminder that small acts of decency can ripple outward in ways that transform the world. Children learned about Nathan and Jora in school. Artists painted murals showing the moment the blacksmith took the orc girl's hand. Bakers sold special pastries on the anniversary of their wedding. But more importantly, the town remembered the lesson beneath the story, that people are worth seeing, worth knowing, worth choosing, regardless of what prejudice might say. That courage is often quiet. expressed not in grand pronouncements but in the decision to reach out a hand and refuse to let fear dictate action. And every spring, without fail, at least one young person would walk across the village square to ask someone else to dance, someone who stood alone at the edge of the light, and the elders would nod to each other and know that the legacy of Nathan Cole and Jora Mirren lived on in the hearts of those who remembered what really mattered. The forge still stands, now operated by the fifth generation of the family. The oak tree on the hill has grown tall and strong, providing shade for those who come to visit the graves of the couple buried beneath. The town has grown and changed, become more diverse, more accepting, more willing to see the humanity in others regardless of what surface differences might suggest. And sometimes, late at night when the forge fire burns low and the work is done, the current smith will stand in the doorway and look out at the square where it all began. They will think about the courage it took for their great-great-grandfather to cross that space and take the hand of a lonely orc girl. They will think about the life that simple gesture created, the family that grew from that moment of bravery. And they will understand, perhaps better than most, that love is not just an emotion but a choice made over and over again, day after day, year after year. A choice to see worth in another person. A choice to build something beautiful despite obstacles. A choice to believe that courage and decency can change the world, one small gesture at a time. The story of Nathan Cole and Jora Mirren is not just a love story, though it is certainly that. It is a story about the power of human connection to transform both individuals and communities. It is a story about the courage to be different and the bravery required to accept those who are different. It is a story about how a single moment can ripple outward across generations, shaping a future that honors the best of what people can be. But most of all, it is a story about a dance. A dance that began when a blacksmith took an orc girl's hand in front of everyone and declared without words that she was worth seeing, worth knowing, worth loving. A dance that continued through years of partnership and family and hard work. A dance that ended only when death parted them, and even then continued in the memories and lessons they left behind. And in the end, that is what matters most. Not the prejudice they overcame or the obstacles they faced, but the simple fact that they chose each other and built something beautiful from that choice. That they danced together, year after year, and taught others by their example that love and courage can indeed change the world. The harvest moon rises over the town, just as it did on that night so many years ago when everything changed. The square fills with music and laughter, with couples dancing and children playing and families celebrating together. And somewhere in that crowd, there is always someone standing alone at the edge of the light, hoping to be seen, hoping to be chosen. And if the legacy of Nathan and Jora means anything, there is also someone watching, someone gathering their courage, someone preparing to walk across that square and take a hand and begin a new dance that might just change the world. Because that is what love does. That is what courage does. That is what happens when people choose to see each other's worth, despite everything society might say to the contrary. The music plays on, and the dance continues, and the story of the blacksmith and the orc girl lives on in the hearts of all who understand that the smallest gestures often carry the greatest power to transform the world.